Okay, so we will get started with a very brief introduction. When I can see for sure that things are redirected. Okay, perfect. So today we have a wonderful guest presenting with us, which is Kate Webb. Dr. Webb is an assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences. And as far as I can tell, does a lot of interesting work looking at the kind of biological factors that are related to stress and trauma and related issues in the psych world. So and then the particular work we're looking at today is about the intersection between individual resilience and socio-environmental factors among trauma survivors. So I'm really interested to hear about this work. Welcome, Kate, and you should be able to go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. You should be able to see my screen, I think, now.
Yep.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about interactions between individual resilience and socio-environmental factors, trauma survivors in the US and South Africa. And I will just do a very brief introduction because I haven't been on these meetings that frequently and for that long. I just joined Duke in September, and I direct the biological embedding of the environment and stress lab, where we investigate how socio-environmental and traumatic stress influences biology and mental health. And we're interested in biomarkers of PTSD that are scalable, cost-effective, and generalizable. We currently have some projects in the US and South Africa, but I actually lived in Morogoro, Tanzania for 2 years working with Apopo, which is a nonprofit organization that trains giant African pouched rats, or panyabuku, to detect infectious disease, landmines, and wildlife. So I'm still involved with that organization, but always looking for ways to get involved with ongoing work in Tanzania as well. So for today, I prepared kind of a 20-ish minute talk that is going to first kind of show the framework that our lab uses for examining PTSD, trauma, and how we identify biomarkers of PTSD. I want to talk about 3 kind of snapshots of projects that we've been working on. One is looking at interactions between individual resilience and socio-environmental resilience in a US-based cohort. And then also interactions between individual resilience and socio-environmental risk in the same cohort. And then I'll end by kind of hinting at potentially a biological cost of individual resilience in a South African cohort. We'll end with some implications and future directions. So we know that individuals with PTSD experience a variety of debilitating symptoms, including hyperarousal, avoidance of trauma-related cues, negative alterations. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of a delay. Negative alterations in cognition and mood, as well as intrusive thoughts like flashbacks. And these symptoms are often chronic, with approximately 40% of individuals with PTSD continuing to show significant symptoms of the disorder 10 years after its onset. The good news is that the data supports that early interventions can be really effective, but there are obstacles to delivering targeted care to individuals at risk. So we really struggle with identifying solid predictors of PTSD trajectories and outcomes. We also know that the disorder is incredibly heterogeneous. So there's now a pretty famous paper that suggests that there's so many different symptom combinations of PTSD that there's ultimately over 600,000 ways to have the disorder. So in order to have targeted and cost-effective and efficient treatment delivery and prevention, we really need to be better at identifying who is at risk. And so establishing early predictors or biological markers of PTSD, even before folks are experiencing symptoms, may help lessen the prevalence and the burden of this condition. Now, the vast majority of work, including some of my own, tries to predict PTSD by examining individual factors. So thinking about how sex, age, prior trauma exposure influences risk after trauma. And we've certainly learned a lot from this work, but it doesn't necessarily take into account key socio-environmental and societal influences that shape individuals' experiences. We widen our lens, we can then consider how additional components of health and how one factor at one level might influence factors at another level. And I tend to think that this framework is really well situated to studying trauma and PTSD because we know that trauma exposure is happening in the environment. And each of these levels is influencing an individual's likelihood of experiencing a trauma and also the type of trauma that they might be exposed to. So whether or not someone develops PTSD is probably or psychologically recovers is probably best understood as a complex interplay between various risk factors and resilience factors. So you're probably familiar with how we're measuring individual factors, but in terms of socio-environmental risk and resilience, in my lab, we're conceptualizing socio-environmental risk, at least in the US, as neighborhood socioeconomic disadvantage using the Area Deprivation Index. This is an index that takes into account census variables spanning domains like education, employment, income, and then it compares neighborhoods to all other neighborhoods relative in the US, where red would indicate a neighborhood disadvantage score of that's higher and indicating that the neighborhood is more disadvantaged than other neighborhoods in the US. In terms of socio-environmental resilience, most of my work is kind of in urban spaces. So we've been thinking about socio-environmental resilience as urban green space. And we've quantified this through high-resolution satellite imagery using the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. This is a map of Boston where I previously was at, and you can see as you get closer to the city center, it's more yellow, indicating a lower NDVI and less presence of green space. And as you get out into the suburbs, you see darker shades of green, indicating a higher presence of green space. So with these variables in mind, let's talk about how we identify predictors and biomarkers of PTSD. So in the search of biomarkers, we don't know who's going to experience a trauma. And so what we can do, and I think many on this call do, is we try to recruit individuals as close to a traumatic event as possible. So the US-based project I'm going to talk about used a longitudinal cohort design where they recruited participants from an emergency department. And then within about 2 weeks post-trauma, they came back for a study visit, where they completed a blood draw where we could derive blood-based markers like DNA methylation to assess biological age. They also completed self-report assessments. They provided their home address, which we could use for geocoding to derive those socio-environmental factors. And then they also underwent neuroimaging. We collected multimodal neuroimaging, but today I'm going to talk about the structural scans, which we can also use to evaluate as an index of biological aging. And then we conduct follow-up assessments and we follow these individuals for about a year post-injury and try to predict who is going to develop PTSD. The data set that I'm going to talk about is called the Aurora study. It's actually based out of UNC, but it was very unique in that it recruited recent trauma survivors from 22 emergency departments across the United States. And this is the largest multi-site study of trauma outcomes to date. I'll say that the majority of folks were younger to middle age and had experienced a motor vehicle collision. Now, before we get too far into the resilience, I just want to note that it's been very well established that socio-environmental risk factors like neighborhood disadvantage are associated with poorer mental and physical health. So in the US, neighborhood disadvantage is consistently and very robustly associated with poorer mental and physical health outcomes, and it predicts PTSD even after adjusting for individual factors. In fact, we also had previously shown in this sample that neighborhood disadvantage was also associated with neurobiological susceptibility for PTSD. So we showed that neighborhood disadvantage was associated with greater threat reactivity in the brain, which is a pattern that is predictive of more severe PTSD. But we were really interested in applying kind of a more strength-based approach and examining how resilience, both at the individual and socio-environmental level, might interact and predict PTSD. So this is a big question and it's been understudied in the field. What about resilience? I kind of spoiled it already that we're looking at green space, but why are we looking at green space? Well, it turns out that urban green space is associated with better mental and physical health. There's been less work done on PTSD, but we think that green space might work through a variety of different pathways. It might encourage exercise, it might buffer against environmental hazards, the effects of climate change. And then there was also some interesting work more in the depression side of how green space might enhance individual resilience and enhance the individual's capacity to cope with different stressors. And so we first wanted to examine whether these quote unquote resilience factors were actually related to resiliency after trauma. And to do this, the first step was identifying PTSD trajectories in this sample. So in over 2,500 trauma survivors, we identified 6 symptom classes. So as some of us might expect, the majority of individuals were classified in a resilient trajectory, which is in the red. Approximately 10% of participants were in a non-remitting high trajectory, meaning they had high symptoms across time, in the pink. Another about 25% were assigned to a non-remitting moderate trajectory in the orange. And then 3 smaller classes also emerged with about 5% each. So there's a delayed trajectory where participants' symptoms increased over time, a slow recovery class where participants had high symptoms up to about 2 months and then decreased, and then a rapid recovery class where participants showed high symptoms initially, and then kind of very quickly those symptoms dissipated. And then we tried to predict the likelihood of falling into one of those trajectories with several individual variables as well as neighborhood disadvantage that are well established. So we looked at sex, injury severity, age, income, marital status, childhood maltreatment, lifetime trauma, head injury. And then we also looked at these two these two resilience factors. So we looked at green space and then also a measure of individual resilience or resources. If you're familiar with the scale Connor-Davidson resilience scale, we use the short form, and it includes items that are pretty broad. So I am not easily discouraged by failure, coping with stress can strengthen me, and I can achieve goals despite obstacles. So we looked at how green space and individual resilience both independently predicted likelihood of falling into a specific trajectory, and then also the interaction. I'll say green space alone actually did not significantly predict PTSD trajectory. Individual resilience did. It predicted the likelihood of falling into a resilient trajectory compared to a non-remitting high or moderate trajectory. But I think what was most interesting is that there was a significant interaction between individual resilience and green space. So this graph is a little bit messy, but on the y-axis here is the probability of being assigned into a specific class. On the x-axis is green space, and then the different panels are faceted by the level of individual resilience, with a score of 40 on the right being the highest score that you can get on the Connor-Davidson resilience scale. So for individuals with the highest individual resilience levels, greater green space seemed to boost the benefits of resilience, so that greater green space was associated with an increased likelihood of assignment in a resilient trajectory compared to a high non-remitting trajectory. So to us, this, when we're kind of interpreting our findings, we thought this really does emphasize that green space alone probably doesn't guarantee falling into a resilient trajectory. It does seem like individual resilience might be required to access the protective features of green space in one's environment. It also may be that living in a greener space actually supports some of the development and maintenance of individual resilience and resources. We also had some limitations which kind of tempered our interpretation. One is that we're really focused on urban areas here. Most of the individuals were recruited from cities. We also don't have a lot of geographical diversity, and we know that there's a lot of difference in green space across the world. And together, we think that this really emphasizes that preventing and treating PTSD likely does require a multi-level approach that emphasizes building individual resilience and increasing an individual's ability to access available resources in their environment, and then also emphasizes the importance of providing evidence-based and supported resources in one's neighborhood. So we thought this was really interesting, but we kind of went back to our initial investigations on socio-environmental risk and thought, okay, if we're seeing these interactions between two resilience measures, is it possible that individual resilience may also buffer against socio-environmental risk? And for this, we actually turned back to the literature on biological aging. So one mechanism that could explain how risk factors like neighborhood disadvantage or even individual level adversity increase risk for PTSD is through accelerated biological aging, which corresponds to the cumulative wear and tear of biological systems or physiological systems. In general, our biological systems age with our chronological age. However, various exposures or diseases can actually result in biological aging beyond what is expected of our chronological age. And we can measure this accelerated biological aging as indexed through epigenetic modifications, such as patterns of DNA methylation, which we know change naturally as we age, but we can kind of use them as epigenetic clocks. We can also look at structural neuroimaging and quantify. We can look at structural features of the brain that also change naturally. But since we know the aging trajectories of these indices, we can then look at an individual's biological profile and see if it's different than one might expect based off of their age. We also know that trauma, adversity, and chronic stress are all linked to more rapid brain biological aging, but also that accelerated biological aging predicts risk for PTSD. Now, we know also that some of the kind of exposures or behaviors that are considered resilience factors can actually be associated with de-acceleration. So we see this pretty consistently with sleep or an active lifestyle, where the folks who are engaging more in kind of healthy or health-promoting behaviors show either de-acceleration or more typical biological age. A recent study had shown actually that individuals with high levels of life stress, but high levels of resilience show more typical biological aging than individuals with low levels of resilience, but similar levels of stress. And this is what we might expect intuitively or even clinically, but we were curious if individual resilience would buffer against a socio-environmental risk factor or neighborhood disadvantage, even in the early aftermath of trauma. So we went back to the Aurora study sample, and we examined the effect of neighborhood disadvantage on different measures of biological aging. Here we're looking at epigenetic aging or clocks. We looked at actually 5 different measures of biological aging. They're all kind of similar in that they examined patterns of DNA methylation, but they were trained on slightly different measures. So I'm just going to show you the results of one here. We found that indeed neighborhood disadvantage is positively correlated with more rapid or advanced epigenetic aging, but there was a significant interaction with individual resilience. So there was a significant interaction between neighborhood disadvantage and the Conrad-Davidson resilience scores, such that individuals with average or lower scores, so in the dotted lines on this graph, neighborhood disadvantage was associated with accelerated aging. However, for individuals with high self-reported levels of individual resilience, so in the solid line, there was actually no association between neighborhood disadvantage and epigenetic aging, suggesting that individual resilience was completely buffering against the kind of negative effects of neighborhood disadvantage. So to wrap up our findings here, we know that advanced biological aging may position individuals at greater risk for PTSD, but it seems as though, and our results would suggest, that interventions targeting individual resilience or psychological resources could actually help address the biological consequences of neighborhood disadvantage and may help prevent the development of PTSD. And one of the kind of big questions that we had when we found these results was, these findings are in recent trauma survivors, and we were really curious what this looks like over time as, PTSD symptoms either persist or as individuals kind of naturally recover. So we had done some preliminary analyses with cross-lagged models trying to figure out the relationship between individual resilience and PTSD over time. We saw that at least in the early aftermath, so about 2 weeks post-trauma, individual resilience was predicting subsequent PTSD at week 8. And this kind of continued this pattern. So individual resilience is predicting PTSD up until about month 3, where it seems though something starts changing, where not only is individual resilience predicting PTSD, but PTSD symptoms, persistent PTSD symptoms start predicting lower individual resilience. So this kind of idea that symptoms are chipping away at an individual's self-report of their kind of resources. So we started wondering if there might be a biological cost of individual resilience over time, particularly in environments where individuals are faced with chronic high levels of chronic stress and adversity. And so this question took us to look at a data set in South Africa. And so why look at a South African sample? Well, it turns out that South Africa has some of the highest prevalence rates of psychiatric disorders. So the yearly prevalence is about a third of the population is experiencing a common mental health disorder. So that's depression, anxiety, or PTSD. And really a driving factor of these high prevalence rates is the exposure to risk factors, including socioeconomic inequities, as well as exposure to traumatic stress. So discrimination and violence during the apartheid has had lasting effects on mental health, and there remains considerable resource inequities and high rates of interpersonal violence. Some of the epidemiological studies suggest that over 3/4 of the population has been exposed to a traumatic event in the lifetime, with the most prevalent exposure being physical violence. So despite a high burden of traumatic stress in South Africa, which is a low to middle income country, most of the research on trauma and biological aging and resilience has all been conducted in high income countries in the US. This idea about potentially a biological cost of individual resilience is not new. There was a prior study conducted in US veterans that examined this, and they found that veterans with PTSD who reported high psychological resilience showed actually accelerated epigenetic aging compared to individuals with similar clinical profiles and low levels of resilience. So this kind of suggested that if resilience factors do not prevent PTSD development in the acute aftermath of a trauma, and individuals are expected to have high levels of functioning while also dealing with symptoms, then having high levels of resilience might actually become a detriment. And this had been suggested before in multiple frameworks of resilience, that how resilience factors operate changes across contexts, so that individual resilience may actually have diminished biological returns in certain contexts. And so we were curious if this would be replicated when we looked at another index of biological aging, which is brain aging. So in collaboration with the neuroimaging team at the University of Cape Town, we turned to a really well-characterized longitudinal study that is the Drakenstein Child Health Study. So this is a multi-year birth cohort study that actually followed mother-child dyads, and it was looking at the etiology and risk factors of chronic mental and physical issues. It was really kind of the first of its kind in South Africa. But the important part is that approximately 18 months postpartum, a subset of mothers came back and underwent neuroimaging. They completed also a battery of self-report assessments. They completed measures of PTSD symptoms, depression, bunch of demographics, and also that Connor-Davidson resilience scale, or measure of individual resilience. Now, of the 189 participants, only 19 reported trauma exposure and met criteria for suspected PTSD, which was a lot lower than we might expect. And only 23 indicated that they were trauma exposed but didn't meet criteria for PTSD. So keep that in mind when we look at the results. For our brain aging, what we looked at was, again, structural neuroimaging and this kind of difference score between the predicted brain age based off of the algorithm that's looking at all the structural features and their chronological age. So the first thing that I want to note is that the association between chronological and predicted age was moderate and comparable to what had been previously found in other South African samples, but far lower than the correlations that we observe in US and European samples. When we stratified by group, we did not see any significant difference between the groups on predicted brain age gap, and also no difference on chronological age. What we did find, though, is, again, we looked at this interaction between individual resilience and group status, and we found that for women with PTSD in the dotted green line, having a higher score of individual resilience was associated with more rapid brain aging. We did not see that relationship in trauma-exposed or non-trauma-exposed participants. So suggesting that there is a biological cost of experiencing high levels of PTSD and having and reporting high levels of resilience. So to summarize, we replicated and extended the previous work, suggesting that in individuals with PTSD, greater individual resilience may be associated with biological aging. And I think that while higher levels of psychological resilience are typically viewed as exclusively beneficial in our field, non-neuroimaging studies suggest that there is this diminished biological return in certain contexts. So a great example of this, which has been consistently shown through multiple decades now, is that among Black Americans who are exposed to high levels of racialized chronic stress, suggests that coping with racialized stressors and using kind of high levels of resilience is associated with greater allostatic load, which is a composite measure of biological dysfunction. And again, suggesting that even if you are psychologically successful or functionally successful, that there may be a biological consequence. This also may be driven by certain coping strategies or individual differences in strategies. So some of the previous work has suggested that there may be kind of higher demands depending on what coping strategy you're using. If you're using suppression or distraction, these are considered high effort strategies over time, which may undermine physical health. And even though we didn't evaluate coping, the individual resilience measure definitely kind of captures participants' willingness to use high effort strategies. The last thing I'll really note is that we had pretty poor performance and what I would consider unacceptable performance in our algorithms here. And so we have to emphasize prioritizing diversity and inclusivity in neuroimaging studies, making sure that we're including individuals from all over the world in these training algorithms, or else we are going to end up with algorithmic biases. And then I think that also, I mentioned this before, but theoretical and conceptual frameworks have talked about resilience factors and how they might kind of operate differently, but that we need to have more empirical work on resilience kind of more broadly. And then I'll end with this, is that I really do believe that this work will help inform trauma prevention efforts and policies. I think it has the possibility to improve the early detection of at-risk trauma survivors. We can also generate and improve and ensure that we have generalizable biological models of PTSD. And hopefully this will lead to the development of new treatments. In terms of future directions of our lab, we are continuing to work on identifying predictors of stress and trauma-related disorders, and also testing effects of socio-environmental risk and resilience factors across populations. So we're still working with the University of Cape Town, and then also working with a large consortium called Enigma that has a lot of neuroimaging data, and then also collaborating with Gemini. So with that, I will say thank you, and I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, but very excited to be here and think about ways that our work can interlock.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think you did a great job of walking us through the story, because there were quite a lot of components there, but I like how you link things together. Questions or comments from the audience online or here in the room?
Well, I find it's a fascinating field. Thanks for guiding us through and bringing that up. We started engaging with some colleagues from the Federal University of São Paulo when Laís was here, one of our visiting students. And they are also looking at some of these relationships between allostatic load and alcohol use. Although they're not looking at PTSD, that's something Nathan was always talking about when he was here with Laís. But one of them is doing a study now that they are looking at this cohort of patients they have that are both alcohol dependent users and non-alcohol dependent users, and looking at their environments. And then they do have a bunch of brain imaging and even some epigenetic markers. It's hard because it's still a cohort that was not designed to look at these characteristics, but I might reach out to you to get some insights on how you're analyzing this data. I particularly was very curious about how you reported those class membership graphs. We've done that a lot, but I never reported that way, so very, very nicely done. I'm always also curious to see the paper, how you guys reported it out. Looks very nice indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share. I will share that paper with you. I think one of the benefits is that we had so much diversity. It was such a large sample size, is that oftentimes when you do those trajectories, as I'm sure you find, you kind of have like low, medium, high, and you don't necessarily get to see the more interesting trajectories emerge. But I'm happy to share that. And then also, I'm always happy to share code as well.
Yeah, cool,
Awesome.
cool. It looks great. I think a question that I would have for you is, if we're trying to design a study that is going to look at environmental stressors, do you guys have, you showed that bioecological model, but do you have a more streamlined group of variables you think are best predictors or best proxies for a junction of stressors that we could start thinking about in a toolkit for similar studies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so one of the things we've been looking into is that certainly the way that publicly available data sets, like the ones that we're using to derive green space and neighborhood disadvantage, vary by country, vary by state, vary by city even. And so there are a number of self-report surveys that have pretty good correlation with some of those geocoded measures, but also are pretty robustly, at least, associated with mental health outcomes. And so I'm happy to share those too. They're kind of neighborhood perceptions that get at either disadvantage or disorder or resource availability, but again, we think are pretty reliable.
Yeah, I'm really curious in general about some of these kinds of measures, cross-culturally in particular, right? So I don't know if you have anything to add there. I mean, South Africa, for example, we know it has like a lot of linguistic diversity. How does that affect the measures? And, of course, these things, especially things like stress, have the cultural differences where, the ways the most salient things we think of when we think of stress in Durham are going to be different from the most salient things that come to mind when you think of stress in another setting.
I worked with a community organization in Morogoro on this exact thing, is that I basically met with them to go over all of the measures that we could think of that have been validated, and we kind of went through and talked about which ones made the most sense, and then their team translated those items into Kiswahili and kind of developed their own measures of stress that were pulled together. So I think you're right, is that it definitely varies. I think with the neighborhood factors, one thing that I like about it is that particularly when there's satellite imagery or census based, there is actually a lot of overlap, is that South Africa has a census where it gets similar measures to the US Census, and so we can kind of build composites and look at how those line up. And then with the satellite imagery, I mentioned green space, but we can look at a lot of different stuff. We can, with spatial temporal modeling, you can look at air pollution, you can look at soil richness and density, agricultural measures. So that makes it really nice to look at cross-culturally.
Yeah. Oh, very fascinating. Your last comment about the association of resiliency and aging.
Yeah.
I think that's a golden kind of result. That's something that I would really like to read more about, because I think that it's important to have this pushback that being very resilient is necessarily resourceful, and there's a trade-off with what kind of environment you live in and the impacts it does, even though you are able to sustain yourself in that environment. That is fascinating. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks. I think the more we can kind of open up our mind for those hypotheses and findings, the better the frameworks, and kind of the more we can improve folks' outcomes. I see a question in the chat, so I don't want to.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Bruna says, congrats on the work, amazing presentation. Not sure how much this could be associated, but do you have any information on whether people with PTSD have parents or other close relatives who had or have PTSD, could that increase the likelihood of developing PTSD or alternatively enhance their own resilience? Great question.
Excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent question and absolutely is very relevant. I didn't talk about this here, but we have some work so there is some genetic heritability, and then also there's some work that suggests there might be some behavioral kind of intergenerational transmission, but intergenerational transmission of trauma and PTSD is for sure something that the field is interested in and exploring more. We have some work that is looking at genetic risk variants for PTSD, and we see that genetic risk can be passed down. So that's something we are exploring. We haven't looked at that so much with interactions with the resilience factors yet, or with the socio-environmental factors, but I think is somewhere we could definitely head.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Other questions before I just keep asking them myself? One other thing that I was wondering about, I mean, to the point that you and Joao were just talking about, you know, resilience being associated with biological dysfunction. I mean, yeah, it's not really far-fetched to imagine that they have some of the same causes, right? Perhaps the trauma or the whether that was an event or a lifetime of stressful experiences, you know, it wouldn't be surprising if that bolstered resilience as we're measuring it, while also giving you these detrimental effects. But maybe apparently they're both detrimental effects in some cases. So I'd be interested to see even more upstream, you know, where does the resilience come from? And is it coming in part from the same sources?
But it kind of goes back into that discussion that when you choose the outcome for your study, the outcome has a lot of political engagement on what that means. And so if you show that resilience has a positive relationship or negative relationship with depression symptoms, that's great.
Right.
But it's not looking about other impacts that long run could harm you. So it's different than looking at adjustment versus looking at well-being or well-living. And I think that's kind of where this discussion goes. So I really enjoyed it. And there's a point around looking at the individual. So are you pressured to develop more coping skills and more resilience to live in this world, or are we pressured to look at stressors and environment? And so there's also the locus of stressor control that is part of this discussion, that these results really question that. And I think that's really interesting.
I think the last thing I'll say about that too is that when you talk to clinicians about, particularly with PTSD, which a hallmark feature of PTSD is a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, and this idea, if you are expected to continue to function and you know, not exhibit symptoms, and you have family depending on you, you have a community depending on you, is that you are maybe going to engage in these different coping strategies. And so I think that it's worth, to your point, looking at the different outcomes and thinking about the specific kind of clinical features and manifestation and how they interact with the community and kind of interpersonal factors.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or questions?
That's great.
Thank you again for having me. I'm
Thank you.
Kind of continuing to be a part of this group and finding ways to work together.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anytime. All right, let's thank Kate again for a great presentation. Thanks so much. All right, so I will